Hello, everyone. My name is Jen Lansford. I'm the Director of the Center for Child and Family Policy, and it is a pleasure to welcome you here today for our Salzburger Distinguished Lecture. The Center for Child and Family Policy sponsors the Salzburger Distinguished Lecture Series to stimulate the intellectual community, not only for our own faculty and students here at Duke, but also the Durham community broadly, and thanks to our virtual reach to people now across the United States and even internationally. The Salzburger Speaker Series brings prominent researchers and policymakers and other leading thinkers in child and family policy to campus to share their expertise on topics and issues impacting children and families. The lectures are made possible through a generous endowment from the Arthur Salzburger family, and I would like to thank Cynthia Salzburger and Stephen Green for their support. They are joining us online today, along with many other people on stage. So if I could remind you to silence your cell phones before we officially launch into today's lecture, I appreciate that. So it's now my pleasure to introduce Brian Samuels, our featured speaker for today's lecture. Brian Samuels is the Executive Director of Chapin Hall, where he leads efforts to integrate evidence into public policy and practice to improve outcomes for children and families. With a career focus on addressing inequities, he guides national work on racial equity in child welfare, juvenile justice, and homelessness. He holds a Master of Public Policy from the University of Chicago and has testified before Congress and frequently speaks and writes on child well-being, trauma, and evidence-based prevention. Prior to joining Chapin Hall in 2013, he was the Commissioner of the Administration on Children, Youth, and Families at the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. He's also served as Chief of Staff at the Chicago Public Schools and Director of the Illinois Department of Children and Family Services. So he has a really illustrative career in public service, and it is a great privilege to welcome him here today. Please join me in welcoming Brian Samuels.
Great. Thanks. It's good to see everybody, and it's great to be back at Duke. I spent a year of my graduate education here at Duke and enjoyed it so much that my wife and I bought land and built a house not that far from this area. So when we weren't in Chicago, we were hanging out in North Carolina. So feels like a little bit like our second home, so it's good to be back and good to spend some time with you. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the work that we do at Chapin Hall. I'm going to try to ground some of my insights in experiences I've had in public agencies, and then talk some about what's going on in the world and how evidence is being used to shape policymaking across the country. I'm going to try to do that in about 50 minutes. And at the end of that 50 minutes, we'll open it up for conversation. I'll be honest, if you had a strong urge and you needed a question answered before I could continue speaking and you being able to hear me, I am glad to pause and take the question. And they'll kick us out of the room at 4:30 away, so no worries there. So as I prepared for this conversation, I really wanted to ground it in the experience that I've had as a leader and the decisions that I've made as leaders that built prior experience. So often it's the case in our professional careers that we struggle to connect the dots between one job and the next, between one assignment and the next. And so I've had the great benefit of having a lot of really cool jobs. And being in those jobs also had the freedom to bring forward lessons learned from one opportunity into the next. And I think it is that iterative process in engaging systems, making hard decisions about the right direction for those systems to go, and practicing and building muscle in the use of evidence to drive policymaking that makes me the leader that I am today. So I I didn't show up this way 35 years ago, but through opportunity, really were able to grow into positions and ultimately be able to influence some of what happens in the world. So just as a quick background, Chapin Hall is a research institute born out of the University of Chicago. Today, we operate as an independent research center, and we're fully remote. So we're in 45 out of the 50 states in terms of the work that we're doing and the projects that we have on tap. And we really place the greatest emphasis on the integration of evidence and policy. There's a strong tradition of that, certainly at the Sanford School. We feel especially blessed to have the opportunity to engage system leaders in meaningful conversations that ultimately produces the kind of change that we all want in a progressive society. And so I'll talk some about the work that we do. I had this crazy idea since I knew all of these really talented master's degree people from public policy school or social work, from MPA schools, to actually drag them inside the research center to be partners with our researchers so that we could speak to the issue from asking those important questions that design studies to supporting efforts through the implementation of a change in policy. So we're a little bit of an odd word these days, but if you take and contrast the skill sets that research staff bring together with those policy trained folks that spent some time in government or not-for-profit organizations together in one place, we think you provide a really unique solution to a set of challenges that occur across the country. I'll also spend a little bit of time giving you a concrete example of thinking about what it looks like to make evidence-based policy. I think we often use the word and assume that others will see it and understand it in the way that we do. I'm going to try to be a little intentional about walking through an example, talking some about the results, and then talking a little bit about the consequences of that process for the way in which the agency operated. And then I'll talk about some of the work that we've been doing at Chapin. So I want to be clear about a couple of things. So when I say policies, folks often assume that what I'm saying is legislation. And that's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying, when I describe something as a policy, what I'm talking about is the who, the what, the when, the where, the how, and the why of a policy, right? That all of those elements meet together to understand the way in which change happens and how operations shift and change across time. So when I talk about systems, what I'm talking about are people, culture, operating procedures, and resources. So when I describe the system, it's not a single person. When I describe a system, it is a combination of those elements that ultimately define the parameters within which it operates and how it produces the results that we care the most about. When we talk about research evidence, I'm really talking about empirical findings and data derived from systematic research methods. And then when I talk about evidence-based policy, what I'm really referring to is the process of using rigorous, objective evidence, data, and research to create policies. So I'm trying to marry those things together in a single definition. And so I'll try to call those things out at different points in the presentation, but wanted to define them just a little bit beforehand. So a long time ago, 2003, I was named the Child Welfare Director for the state of Illinois. And on the day that I was named the Child Welfare Director, there were 600 young people who had run away from foster care, and we hadn't seen them in at least a month. Given the vulnerability of that population, given the imagination, where your imagination goes, when you imagine what those young people are doing outside the system, we clearly needed to respond quickly. And so, as I understood those numbers, I asked a series of the obvious questions. Who are these young people? Have they run before? What has their experience been like in the foster care system? Are they running from something, or are they running to something? Do we know, or do we understand what happened that motivated the run? Was there an event? Was there a conversation? Was there an action that we think triggered the response to running away? And so those were fairly straightforward questions for which I received few answers. That unfortunately, in a system that large, this young people, 600 of them, represented less than 3% of the total population in that system. And I think most folks thought that that was a lot to ask of them to account for a policy and whether it is working or not working for such a small population of young people. They also responded or implied that part of the reason why they didn't understand why those things were occurring were developmental. Young people make odd decisions at odd times. Why would you expect us to be able to explain why they did what they did? Because most of those leaders had different experiences throughout the child welfare system, and they only had a limited access to when young people ran away, that they assumed that action in and of itself was random. It wasn't predictable. How could they have known? And ultimately, the response was, well, that is really important, but that's the caseworker's responsibility. So they had taken it off of their list of things to worry about and given it to somebody else. And so why would one have expectations that they could answer those questions? And so obviously I needed to solve the problem, and I needed to solve it really fast. So we came up with this crazy 30-day plan where we were going to go find all 600 of these young people. So it was kind of an all hands on deck approach. We brought everybody together in the room. We gave everybody very specific set of activities. For our caseworkers, we outlined the checklist of activities that they were going to engage in. We brought back retired supervisors who could go through all of the case files, look at all of the names, look at all of the places where those young people might be, prioritize a list that then would be handed off to the caseworkers. We worked with the police to update all of the information that the police should have had about each of the young people, given the amount of time that they were on run. We posted their name and information on the missing and exploiting website to make sure that the public also was aware that these young people were vulnerable, that they were missing, that we hadn't seen them in quite a while. And I thought 30 days was a reasonable timeline to find 600 kids. Well, needless to say, it didn't happen in 30 days. It didn't even happen in 60 days. But it was more like 90 days before we found all 600, including one young man who had been arrested, charged, went to court, got convicted, and was sitting in the state juvenile justice system rather than in a foster home or a group home. And so it showed me the challenges of understanding how to align policy to respond to some things that seemed to be relatively predictable. But I couldn't rely on my own knowledge. I had none. I never worked in a child welfare system. I hadn't run one, wasn't responsible for those decisions. But I did have a strong instinct that there was a way of knowing who these young people were, as well as thinking through what the appropriate response to their running away was. And so we leveraged one of many contracts we had with research institutes across the state. We had one quantitative study that really looked at the population and their placement history to understand how different or similar they were to everybody else in the foster care system. At that point, they ended up looking at about 14,000 young people who had ever run from care between 1993 and 2003. The results were quite interesting. One, they were more likely to be young ladies rather than young men. They were disproportionately African American. Most of them had a history of placement instability. Most had experiences being placed in group homes. And 99% of them had run before. We also did a qualitative study that included about 600 young people as they returned from being on run. And the goal there was to understand both what motivated them to run, the set of activities they engaged in while they were on run, and where they physically go, who were they with, to get a better understanding of what were some of the drivers to their decisions. We took a little bit of comfort in the fact that they weren't running from something. Most of them were running to something. A big part of their decision to run was normal adolescent behavior, in the sense that the rules were too restrictive for them to do what they wanted to do. So they needed to ignore the rules in order to do what they wanted to do. And that they were most likely to run to see a relative as well as a sibling. So lots of them talked about their cousin or their brother having a basketball game that they really wanted to be at. And there was nothing in the policy manual that let them go to that basketball game. And so left with the choice of either following the rules and not going to the game, or breaking the rules but going to the game, this group of young people decided that they would in fact go to the game. So many of them did. And so it was in the context of having those two studies, having an internal group of staff that were working with researchers on those two studies. What came from that was a set of reforms that are, I think, important to articulate. So part of the strategy here was to try to map directly what the findings were to where in the system there were levers that one could pull in order to produce a different result. And so the first component of that plan was specifically addressing the group home experience, that a lot of young people found themselves placed in group homes because they had moved their way through foster homes and relative homes. Group homes was the last place that they could be. They weren't terribly happy there. But most of them were frustrated with the policies that didn't allow them to engage in normal activities and to do things on shorter notice, right? So in the child welfare system, there are no circumstances in which you can go and be with somebody else without prior approval. These young people didn't have time for prior approval, and so they had to make hard decisions. And so the group home environment was an environment that was ripe for change for these young people. And so we made a series of changes there. We also found that we had to changed the incentive structure so that the group homes actually told us when kids ran away. Because the most likely behavior was that a lot more than 600 young people ran away. They just ran away for a day. And the group homes, which didn't really want to write a report about a kid who ran away for a day, they waited for a day, or maybe 2 days, or maybe even 3 days for that young person to come back with the hopes that they don't have to write that report. Right? So we actually tried to flip the expectations and actually create an incentive for them to report as quickly as possible, and then to reward them for having done such an act. We also changed the way caseworkers engaged young people while they were on run, what exactly the set of activities that caseworkers were responsible for. We really focused a lot of our effort on identifying young people that were running for the first time, since the data was really compelling that one ran led to a second run, which lands great. And so really targeting for the caseworker and the placement that they were in, whenever a young person had that first run, there was a major pause and intervention to look at all of the aspects of what was going on there. We also centralized keeping track of young people. So it was no longer just the responsibility of the caseworker, but there was a system that captured where all young people were at their state of run, from recently left to having returned, all really important stuff to have a systematic response. We also required a review of the placement option at the time that they came back, right? Because it's often the case in the child welfare circumstances where the home that you were placed in is likely to be not the perfect option for you, but the best available option. So when a young person ran away from foster care or a group home, it begs the question, were there any other options for placement at that time that would have been a better fit for that young person than the fit that they were in, simply because that group home was available on the moment in which that young person, needed to be placed somewhere. We created a set of performance metrics that cut across the entire agency. All of that coming from 2 studies that were pulled apart and changes made to produce a different result. The good news is that we got a really great result, right? Which is that we reduced the number of kids that ran away from foster care by more than half. And we reduced the amount of time that they were on run by more than half. So we were better at anticipating and addressing the needs so that they did not have to run. And when they chose to run, we were a lot better at finding them and bringing them back into care. But more importantly, while those results were really important, it really did set a foundation for how the department thought about solving problems. So most of the experience in the Child Welfare Agency had been that research resulted in criticizing their action. And so this was the first experience they had where the research actually got translated into a solution for which there was a positive outcome. So that had a reverberating effect on the system. It was also one of the first times that people felt comfortable acknowledging that there were other small problems that might be addressed more effectively. And so it created the space where people could bring forward a problem and not feel like they're either one going to get punished for acknowledging that there's a problem, or instead they were going to bring forward a problem and then be left alone to solve the problem. So in many instances, it's better just not to say anything and to live with the problem than acknowledge it and then be on the radar screen for then future sanctions because they couldn't by themselves solve the problem. And then ultimately, it created a clear and direct way to better use the research we were paying for by marrying those research projects projects with staff inside the agency who could see the questions that were being designed, could see the sample that was going to be engaged, that could see the preliminary findings and analysis, that could see the emerging findings and final results of the study, and to be thinking from that entire arc of time, what's the solution to those findings, as opposed to the study lands on their desk, they didn't know it was coming. When they got it, everybody else got it, and they had to try to find a way to address the findings without any other preparation or any opportunities themselves to engage others in the process. And so it shifted the way people thought about solving problems inside the agency. It really became the way we did business and solved most of our problems. It created an opportunity for us to be a much better consumer of research. And we actually had a very transparent process where people could elevate the issues and concerns that they had about the work that they were doing. We could have an explicit conversation about the relative importance of any of them. We could then figure out who we were going to contract with to answer the first set of questions. And you, as a staff person, could see where you were at on the list of questions, and you knew when your opportunity was going to come to also have the benefits of somebody doing a deep dive on the issues that you're concerned about and the challenges that you face. And so I couldn't have told you that that was going to be the perfect way to start leading an agency, because I wouldn't have known that per se. But it had a profound effect on the organization and its culture. And it allowed me to be in a position of asking the right question on a regular basis, having them begin to anticipate almost all of my questions, and them beginning to answer those questions long before they showed up in my office. So a powerful redirection of the culture of that agency that more empowered them to understand the nature of the work that they were trying to do and that they were committed to do. And to be able to do it in a place for which you weren't harmed for simply acknowledging that there was a problem. So an amazing experience. It's not the only experience I've had in leadership positions. In most of those leadership positions, research and evidence have been central to what was driving the work of the day. And I'll just name a couple of those positions and the way in which research was relevant there. So my first job in a public leadership position was in the state of Nebraska. The legislature had passed a bill that called for the integration of 6 state agencies into one agency, and they gave the new leadership teams 30 months to execute the entire plan. The legislature was driven by the research around the need to integrate services, showing all of the discontinuities that existed in state policy, how difficult it was for a family that had more than one issue to access multiple services at the same time. So the legislature was motivated by all of the research around integrated services and the benefits that might come from it. They also were hypersensitive to customer satisfaction information. There was a ton of evidence that people weren't satisfied with what they were getting in the state of Nebraska. And for the amount of money that the state was spending, the legislature thought it might make sense to try to make sure that there was a benefit to what they were spending. And then it was a red state. It was in the 90s, government efficiency was central to everything they thought about. Any forms of duplication, any opportunities to pare back duplicating activities, to create a more seamless system, but one that costs slightly less than the current one, they were all for that. And so I joined a team of people that had that 30-month objective and spent most of it in planes, trains, and automobiles, but that's a different story. One of the really important parts of this work was also this crazy idea, that maybe we want to set up some learning labs where we could actually go try some things. And based on those efforts, extract from those learning labs important information and build that into the cycle of improvement. So my role, I was responsible for integrating the field offices. So I had to go to every field office in every county that had one. I had to try to figure out how to connect with each of those field offices, convince them that they really did want to integrate, that they really did want to offer the client a one-stop shopping experience, and that they really were going to be, they were going to feel better about themselves if they could be successful in integrating these services. And so, again, this idea that systems, by definition, are about the people, the culture, operating procedures, and resources. That was essentially the job. It was trying to figure out how to get people, how to shift culture, how to reorient operating systems, and how to reallocate resources. And I had done a total of none of that stuff. So I spent a ton of time in the literature trying to understand who are these people that work for these individual agencies. What are the underlying programs and policies that they're responsible for? How might the work look different in one agency over another agency? And how did I, as an African-American male, show up to a room of almost all white people and convince them that I really did have their best interest at heart? No, you don't know me. I'm not from here. Don't worry, I don't look like you, but I totally got your back. Right? Took a lot of work. I couldn't have got there without the literature. But we also didn't get very far. So we spent most of our time doing that 30 months with the Human Resource Department and the youth. And we spent most of that time focused on fixing titles, duties and responsibilities, and equal pay. But a fascinating experience. The takeaways there were really not surprising, but important as the journey I had in front of me. The biggest takeaway is that besides all those highfalutin ideas around integration and customer service and efficiency, our success or failure came down to people, culture, and structure. If we couldn't shape those things, we weren't going to get systems change. The second was that in a lot of ways, the use of evidence in most of those circumstances what felt like a threat to staff because it felt like research was competing with the beliefs and experience that they had. So when there was a difference there, they saw that as a competition for which they needed to win, which meant that all of the research that got put in front of them, it was almost a waste of time. The learning labs were reviewed by most of those staff as threats to the existing structure. That the result of those learning labs' success wouldn't result in positive change inside of government. It was the duties and responsibilities inside of government would get picked up and moved outside of government into community activities. And so even though we thought that the lived experience in those community labs would inspire people to change, more than likely they saw those learning labs as a threat. And then the last part is I spent a lot of time in the literature around translation of research because I really tried to figure out how to make these very user-friendly presentations the right ways to bring people together. It is safe to say that translation is about more than just the language that you use. And so I made it through the 30 months, but we never got that agency across the finish line. I talked about the DCFS experience I had. I'll just make a couple of comments there. It was totally the deep end of the pool. Most people described it as the worst job in government. That also explains why there weren't a whole lot of people that wanted that job. So the fact that I was totally unqualified for it increased the likelihood that I'd actually be considered. And the most striking thing about pursuing that job was the very first question that the governor asked me in my final interview is not what are your aspirations, what's possible, what do you need? It was how do you keep the system out of the papers? Because if I could solve that problem, he had defined what success was. But there was a lot more to being successful in that job than just keeping it out of the newspapers. And admittedly, I wasn't great at doing it. And there were probably instances where I was putting the agency in the newspaper when it didn't have to be. But that's a conversation for beers and wine. But what was really interesting about that opportunity was that the agency itself had seen this great evolution, and I was coming at a really critical time in that evolution that allowed me both to evaluate what was successful in the policies and procedures of what preceded me, as well as what the pivot looks like and what does the research tell me about where to take the agency. So in the 6 years prior to me becoming the director of that agency, it had reduced the population of kids in foster care from 51,000 kids in care to 23,000 kids in care. So a 28,000 kid reduction in 6 years. It did that through really smart policy making. It did that by essentially closing the front door of the system so that it was hard to enter, right? Creating economic incentives for everybody in the system to achieve system outcomes, which is moving the kids out of foster care, right? And then it partnered with the courts because so much of keeping or getting a kid out of the system are the decisions that the court made. So it was the first time that a child welfare agency actually gave money to the court system. Separate body of government, separate entities, separate politicians, but we actually gave money to the court system because we wanted to accelerate the pace at which kids were leaving care. And so it was that alignment that we created, right? It was the incentive structure that was created there that really drove those changes. Now one might beg the question whether the results were great for those 28,000 kids. And if you assume that all things in foster care are bad, then you might assume as long as they left foster care, there might be better. The likelihood was that there were better results. I don't know that we knew that at the time. And that probably wasn't the focus of the policy itself. It was to reduce the footprint. And it was able to do that. And so the challenge that I had was what to do next. I couldn't outrace the guy for getting another 28,000 kids out of the system because they had already left, right? And in a lot of ways, what you saw is a system that had gotten the easiest kids and families that they could out of the system, and what you were left with was a smaller population, but one that was older. That had been in care for a longer period of time, had made more behavioral health issues, and had experienced multiple placements. And so I leaned on the literature. I stumbled into the trauma literature 25 years ago, and realized that maybe some of the kids that had all of these behavioral issues didn't actually have a mental health diagnosis. They had experienced trauma that led to a set of behaviors that looked like they were mental health diagnoses. The downside to that experience was when they were getting treated for things that they probably didn't need to be treated for and were taking meds that they shouldn't probably be taking. And so my challenge was to shift around the system by thinking through how to align or realign the system so that it addressed the issues of trauma as a common experience and not wait for the behavior to indicate that it was. All these kids were traumatized when they walked through the door of the system. So the system at every point needed to be a therapeutic activity and not a business and process mapping activity. And so big change there. We had to think developmentally. We kept treating all of these kids, all of our policies assumed that every kid at every age got the same thing. A 3-year-old and a 13-year-old aren't the same thing. So we had to think in a much more nuanced way about developmentally, how do policies have to shift? And then ultimately, we had to try to figure out how to take a system that felt really successful at achieving systems level outcomes like permanency to focus on individual outcomes like the well-being of the child, to be able to understand improved functioning in meaningful ways and have that be an intended outcome of the intervention itself. And so I learned a couple of things there. Really, one, that there's no policy that works well for everybody. There are unintended consequences to every policy. Changing changing systems successfully do require alignment. So if I wanted to change one policy, if that's the only thing I did, we open the door for incongruency with all of the other existing policies. And so the thought process as a policymaker was, when I do this over here, what's the downstream effect of all of the actions that ripple off of that? And what does it look like to make alignments across multiple departments? Again, all of this stuff grounded in who were these young people, what were their experiences, what were the challenges they were facing, and ultimately, what did the literature tell us about what we might do different? I spent a bunch of time in the Chicago Public Schools as the chief of staff there. I think the coolest part about that experience was really thinking about how to help a CEO who was convinced that all you had to do was lock the doors in the morning and keep everybody and everything out of the school and let the school staff just do what they do, and that would improve outcomes for all kids. There were a whole bunch of kids for which they needed a lot more than just the ability to focus in an academic environment. And across time, we were able to build a broader understanding of what the learning process looks like and how addressing a whole variety of needs, even if it had to happen inside the school by bringing other people in, that there were real limitations to the strategy. And I could find some evidence of those limitations. The most striking of that evidence, which was that we could find, we took a look at third graders and we asked the question, if you're a third grader and you're in the bottom quartile in the Chicago Public Schools, what was the likelihood that you would leave the bottom quartile by the time you graduated? It was like 70% of kids that were in the bottom quartile never left the bottom quartile during their entire educational experience. And so for those young people, locking the doors and keeping people out was insufficient. And I couldn't have made that case if I didn't have research and evidence to support it. But the real positive experience there was to watch a leader that was about my same age, had a totally different set of experiences, be open to shifting his brain around what he understood the literature to say and what he thought was the secret sauce that he had been delivering for for 6 years already, to watch him shift, change, and adjust, and then become a participant in all of those incremental changes that needed to happen, so that we could address the needs of young people that had greater challenges, for which having a great teacher was necessary but insufficient. And so in all of those experiences, I've got a set of lessons learned, and then I'll flip to closing out by calling out a number of changes that are happening in the field today, related to evidence, that folks might find interesting and be willing to start conversations about what they mean for the field and what they need for the body of work that's being done here at Duke. So, I mean, I think the big takeaways across all of those programs is that policy is more of an evolution than it is transformation. That if you look across all of those jobs, you see in Nebraska, customer service becomes lived experience, right? Or learning labs become place-based initiatives. That government efficiency becomes return on investment, and that prevention becomes upstream intervention. That all of those words form around a single set of ideas that continue to evolve, but by themselves aren't radically different over the 25-year life of me working in this space. Which I actually take comfort in knowing, because it also means that the literature is deep and meaningful, and there is a lot to learn already in what we have. That since often it is in the case of policy, that if they haven't heard about a study in a particular area, that means that there was no study, right? But the evolution of these ideas and the testing of them, and ultimately, I think the refinement of them, are all really thoroughly represented in the literature. And it's really about how to bring all of that meaning and evidence forward, so that policymakers today don't believe that the things that they think are important are so radical that there isn't a basis of learning available for them, right? So they don't go out and make the same mistake, they make a new mistake because they've leveraged the literature and the evidence to do that. So we can talk some more about that. But I'll talk specifically about some of the work that we're doing at Chapin and how it relates to evidence and evidence use. So I think one of the most striking trends that you're seeing in the field itself, is this movement past evidence-based interventions to think about evidence more broadly in policymaking. So we spent a lot of time in the Obama administration finding ways of bringing forward evidence-based interventions and convincing Congress to fund them. And for a lot of people, that became evidence-based policy, was finding programs, making those programs available to kids in the right place at the right time for the right reason, and getting better results. That people are now thinking about evidence in a much broader way. So as you can remember at the start of my presentation, I defined policy as the who, what, when, where, how, and why. There's a ton in the literature about the who, about the when, about the how and the why. And so policymakers are trying to integrate insights into who the young people are or who the families are, into insights about what were the prior circumstances they found themselves in. And they're trying to tie that to what's their understanding of the skills and competencies that they have. That there's this rich literature and environment of knowledge that policymakers are trying to bring forward, and not limit the evidence to just the evidence-based interventions that they can fund. Because the vast majority of what happens in public systems aren't programs, they're policies and practices. And so if they want to see the results of improved performance or see the results of kids and families getting better, they're realizing that they need to bring as much evidence they can into the agency. And there's so many more opportunities to intervene differently than just relying on evidence-based interventions. I'm not diminishing the importance of evidence-based interventions. It's just the window is getting wider, and policymakers are asking the right questions around what does the evidence tell us about a whole bunch of things, not just about what it tells us about whether a program works or doesn't work. I think a lot of public agency leaders are thinking about building continuums of prevention. A lot of what's in the literature, or a lot of the focus of the literature, is around primary prevention. But there are so many families that have a set of experiences before they come into one system. And there's been some harm done, there's been some damage and experiences that families have for which primary prevention is beyond sufficient. And so you've got public leaders now that are asking, what are all the other things we might do to prevent another set of outcomes from occurring? And so they're asking really hard questions about, how do I build a continuum from primary to the front door of the system? And so that's all of the upstream work that we've been doing. So we've been helping folks look at where were young people at before they came into the system. So a lot of that work, for example, is in the homeless space, where these kids are homeless, and the question is, what other agencies touched their lives before they showed up homeless? And could any of them have responded differently? And if they had responded differently, might that young person not be sitting in front of that homeless program? And so in South Carolina, we've linked all of that data between the continuums of care, the Child Welfare Agency, the Juvenile Justice Agency, and the Medicaid Agency, to begin to understand the prior experiences of young people and vulnerable families, and begin to imagine with those system leaders whether there are things that they could and might do differently, informed by the literature, that has a better prospect of reducing the likelihood that a young person shows up in front of them. Policymakers are increasingly thinking developmentally. They're not thinking that an intervention or a policy is going to work across all ages. And so they're trying to segment the population and try to understand what I might do for a 0 to 5 population may be distinct from what I do for a 13 to 18-year-old population. And how do I make the meaningful distinctions there by understanding adolescent development? Increasingly, there's a focus in our prevention work, our homeless work. We're helping to try to differentiate the developmental stages of the young adults who are experiencing homelessness. About 1 in 10 experience some housing instability in that age group during the year. And so thinking about what does an 18 to 24 year look like versus a family of 4 where the parents are in their 50s and 60s, or a homeless vet, or a person that's got a mental health problem. So really trying to reorient themselves, not to think about intervening in policies as universal, but trying to get better results by thinking developmentally and trying to target a particular age group to tweak and adjust programs and policies to better fit where they're at developmentally. I think there's not a system leader in the country that hasn't realized that for most of these problems, they can't solve them by themselves. And so you see a lot of cross systems work that is going on in the country. And I think that that's also supported by the realization that that growing public programs are not likely. And so they're looking for, are there ways of combining my resource efforts with others in ways that reduce my spend and reduce the number of people that show up in my programs? And so a great example of that is the work that we did in children's mental health in the state of Illinois. The governor's office picked up the phone and called us one day and said, we think we have a child welfare problem and we need you to fix it. And the problem that they were having was that there were kids in residential treatment programs that got to the end of their medical necessity for that treatment program. And those kids were remaining in the residential treatment program, which meant a kid who needed that spot couldn't get that spot. And the delays were long because DCFS couldn't find a placement for those kids. So we got into the data, we pulled it apart. What we saw was it was a cross systems issue. It wasn't a child welfare issue. The only reason why it was a child welfare issue was because the day before that kid met medical necessity, the child welfare agency didn't know that kid existed. So the child welfare agency was forced to find placements for those kids after they had met medical necessity, right? So they didn't have any history, they didn't have the ability to anticipate. So they were scrambling to find homes and placements when moving that kid out would have created more space. It turned out that it was a public education issue for kids with IEPs who needed residential treatment. There aren't a lot of them, but when they need them, they were accessing the same programs that kids that are in foster care that need a placement in a residential treatment with kids that were in JJ that needed it, right? And so what you saw was this intersection of all these different policies and how each system dealt with them differently. And if you couldn't align the policies across multiple agencies, you couldn't solve the problem. And so this cross systems work was about identifying all of those policy constraints and discontinuities, trying to figure out how to clean them up, and actually try to figure out how to clean them up in a way in which the agency, each of the agencies would actually take responsibility for something that before they did not think was their responsibility. And then that process ultimately led to a set of research projects around getting to better results and trying to think through how do you design a system that responds to high levels of mental health need, medium responses, and more community-based responses, in part because slow movement at the lower end of the scale, at the community level, meant that those kids moved up the ladder of need and ended up competing with others for space that if we had intervened more effectively, we might have got to better results. I'll name three more and then I'll shut up. So you see this, I talked about this some in terms of developmentally, but I think most policy leaders are starting to ask the questions about subgroups, right? So if we're doing work in the juvenile justice system for Cook County, and they're trying to differentiate those young people who come in and have mental health problems versus those kids that have developmental problems versus those kids that have behavioral health problems, right? And so they're recognizing that not all of these kids look exactly the same and that their response to their circumstances can't be the same for all young people. And so they're trying to carve out and use the literature to understand subgroups and then use those subgroups and the characteristics that they represent and design and tweak policies to address the unique circumstances of those subgroups. The last two here One is around this idea of preventing trauma or preventing re-traumatization of kids and families. This idea that that we know that lots of kids that show up in these public systems have already been traumatized, but people are starting to recognize that the actions of the agency themselves is also traumatic. And so there's this increasing effort to try to look at each stage of engagement, what might be experienced as traumatizing and what might you do different. So as a concrete example, thinking about the young people in Cook County that are arrested, determined to be retained, are placed in a juvenile detention center waiting for a court hearing. Most of these kids don't imagine that the cell door will ever slam for them. And so it's a uniquely challenging and traumatic experience. But it actually turns out that about 50% of those kids are released from detention in 3 days. So if you could figure out how to respond better to those 3 days, you could eliminate the possibility that kid ever has the experience of being locked in a cell by themselves. And so there are a lot of systems leaders that are trying to look at those circumstances and say, is there a better way to do this? What does the evidence and research tell us about this experience? And how do I tweak or adjust to reflect my desire not to re-traumatize a young person that's already in a bit of difficult circumstances, and then the last point I would make, and then I think we have about 27 minutes of conversation, this is not surprising, but I'll just say it out loud, that every government agency that we work with is trying to figure out how to reduce their footprint. They're trying to be less involved with as many families as they are and be more involved with a fewer number. But that movement begs the question, then who's responsible for everybody else? And so it's a conundrum, but it's one that we've been confronting across a number of initiatives. And the Family First Prevention Act, which is a federally funded strategy to prevent kids from coming into foster care through stronger, more evidence-based responses to the needs of the parents, primarily around mental health, substance abuse, and parenting. It's in that context, the child welfare agencies are trying to figure out, okay, if I can keep this parent out of the system, good for me, but I don't have the expertise to provide the drug treatment that they need. And so what happens if I use the resources I have to keep that family out, but there's insufficient service and capacity to address their needs in some other place? And so you've got this real push-pull tension between leaders who know they've got to do less, and in doing less, try to get better at the work that they do. But the large policy constraint is who takes responsibility for all those young people and families that they choose not to serve. So I don't know that I could have thrown more at you in 50 minutes, but I'd love to stop talking and hear what people's reactions are to any and all of that experience.
Thank you very much for such a compelling set of remarks. You gave us a lot to think about. You're right that we have time for questions and discussion. So if you're on Zoom, you can feel free to type your questions into the chat, and we will have someone who can read out your questions from Zoom. The floor is yours. and I'll start.
I'll take the softball. Easy one.
Well, so I loved your definition of policy in terms of thinking about the who and when and why and the how. And I think that's a really different way of thinking about policy, actually, that I like a lot. And it suggests a more implementation orientation to policy, I think, because I think in contrast to the legislation idea, which is, boom, here's what the policy is, all of those questions really speak a lot about implementation. And I liked all of your examples about how you put policies into action and all that's involved in talking to the key people at multiple different levels of systems. And so I guess my question that's kind of embedded in all of that is, kind of other tips you might have for those of us in this room who are interested in really thinking more about an implementation framework as we think about policies and changes.
So I think my understanding of policy, and that definition really is grounded in the School of Public Policy. So both the classes that I took here, as well as the classes that I took at the University of Chicago, really did do a great job of defining policy as something more than a couple of words or legislation. And it created an expectation that no single one rule would be applied to everybody. That was reinforced at the federal level. That they think in very specific terms about who gets what do they get, when do they get it, how much does it cost, how long do they get it, what's the intended result, how do we know that it works? Because that's the way that the Congressional Budget Office actually estimates the cost of that policy. And so the way I backed into that experience was I spent the first 6 months of my job in DC going around and educating every senator who would listen about the issues of trauma and the role that trauma plays in child welfare, juvenile justice, runaway homeless youth, all of those things. And I had these great stories, just like I can stand up and tell these stories. And I had this legislative aide who had to go with me every time I went up to Congress. And probably the third time I was up there, he said, Brian, your stuff is really compelling. He said, but what's the policy? Give the senator who you care about related to trauma, and to delineate each of the characteristics. And then he said, let me help you do that. And so that became the way I made all of my visits to the Hill, was to be able to take that set of characteristics and to say, I really think what you're doing is great. The reauthorization of this bill would be really great. And here are the 5 things that I would change along the continuum of characteristics. It immediately eliminated for me the barrier of people feeling like I was talking in very academic terms with them about trauma, to one that they then wanted to begin to negotiate, well, why that population and not this population? Okay. That's when you got hooked. Because when they're trying to figure out how to answer all of those questions, you've actually started to move them towards a real change in policy. And so my point is obvious, which is I didn't come up with that definition of what policy looks like. I benefited from public policy school. And then I had a set of experiences that reinforced the importance of being able to articulate those things. And then, the work of working with the Congressional Budget Office when we were proposing new legislation to be able to speak to all of those issues were really powerful. And it got people on the Hill who wouldn't have otherwise paid attention to pay attention. And that engagement is the beginning of change. What else?
Thinking about all of your experience, sort of the intersection between research and policy, which is what we're all trying to achieve. What advice would you have for people? I'm thinking primarily research people, to really make those connections themselves with policymakers, to make sure that their research is staying relevant to policy and hopefully contributing to solutions and not just coming across, as you were saying, as complaints or, you know, criticism or competition.
Sure. So find 2 or 3 that work in the general space that you care about. Learn as much as you can about them and go introduce yourself to them and talk about their work, not about your work. It's the download of understanding what they care about, how they think about it, what they're trying to accomplish. That then is going to put you in a better position to say, this study is better than this study. This work is more relevant than this work. If you do it in the reverse and you actually bring what you've already completed, you're assuming that they care about what you just completed and how you did it. And by starting the engagement from learning from them, their priorities, their worldview, the things that they care about, it allows you to look at what you've got in front of you that you think is the most relevant and frame it in meaningful ways. So that's one. I'm going to make a suggestion that I think plays out. So admittedly, there are limitations to a person running a research center that doesn't have a research background. Then I don't have a PhD. But the flip side of that was that my policy degree and my training in policy positions allows me to engage leaders in ways long before they have a research need, right? So that when they have a research need, they feel comfortable reaching out. And sometimes that might be best achieved by one person in the institute or a couple people in the institute, that because of the institute's priorities, you can map that on to who's at the state level and the local level that should care about this stuff. Always be cultivating relationships with those leaders at a high level so that when they then need something, somebody can figure out exactly which researcher this work is most relevant. So I think it's got to figure out, it's one or the other. It's either you figuring out who the 2 or 3 people are and cultivating a relationship, or it's somehow introducing the work of the center to people early in their positions and cultivate relationships. So when the need comes, they pick up the phone and they call the center before they call somebody else or before they move on to the next issue, because they don't have a Rolodex of people who can answer those questions. So getting in their Rolodex before you putting something in front of them is just a really important part of laying the foundation of a relationship. I got this yesterday. I got this great email. Former colleague of mine who is in a leadership position in a child welfare agency sent me an email. She said, "Hey, the legislature is asking me why I'm not using predictive analytics in removals of kids into foster care. What is this? Why does it exist? What am I supposed to do with it? And does it work?" I didn't go to her and talk to her about predictive analytics. When she had to figure out the answer to that research question, she knew to flip through her Rolodex and send an email to me first. I then turned around and said, I know there are 3 people inside the Chapin Hall that have done work on predictive analytics. So I emailed all of them. I said, send me a couple of papers that you think best represent your work. I put those things back together and I put that stuff back in her email by the end of the day. And she was incredibly grateful. They may or may not actually do work on that issue. But if they choose to do work on that issue, they're gonna ask us to do it. But again, it was a pre-existing relationship. It was a firm foundation. I wasn't putting something in front of them that they weren't ready to digest. But when they figured out that they needed help in that space, we were the logical people to call on. I think that's the kind of relationship you want to build over time, because the work that you do is really important. But to take it to that next level means bringing more people towards you. Other questions, comments?
Thank you so much for that talk today. My name is Dr. Mario Lelucci. I'm Assistant Dean over at the Nicholas School. I have a unique connection to your work, as you know, as a byproduct of the Cook County foster care system, and someone who actually studies these same issues that you talked about, and that's written on these topics. I was really fascinated with your talk about cross-system collaboration and how that is needed to address some of the deeply systemic, interconnected issues that reinforce foster care placement in the first place. So I was curious to know, how did you and your team tackle the issue of system involved youth who are mislabeled with disabilities, but are actually demonstrating signs of trauma from their placement during, before, or after foster care?
Yeah, great question. So this issue of kids in foster care being disproportionately diagnosed with a mental illness played itself out in Illinois. It also played itself out when I was in Washington, D.C., around the issue of psychotropic medications and the disproportionate rate at which kids in foster care are prescribed psychotropic medication, and the question about is it the appropriate intervention for the problems they had? And in DC, I had this great panel of researchers who had spent, like 1,000 years collectively looking at issues of psychotropic meds and diagnoses and foster care. And they all agreed that it was very likely that a large percentage of young people were demonstrating more symptoms of trauma and less likely to be diagnosed. But I couldn't get a single one of them to say that the system should be using fewer psychotropics. So the research was really helpful up to a point, but it still then required me to take the step of saying, and therefore I've concluded, which is scary when it's a medical condition or circumstance. So we did a couple of things. One, we stopped doing mental health assessments. Diagnoses during a crisis. A lot of times what happens is the kids in foster care, a crisis occurs, they're engaged in something that ramps them up and that engage and they act in ways that are inappropriate or surprising and it's in the intervention in that crisis that they're trying to figure out what the problem of the kid is, and they get the link. And so part of what we try to do in our clinical department was to document when a young person received their diagnosis and by whom. Because the other thing that's really surprising is that there's a small number of doctors that work in those systems that have very similar patterns of diagnosis. So the other was trying to figure out, were these the kids and their symptoms, or was it the person that was doing the assessment? And then we did everything we could to find trauma-based interventions, mostly relying on cognitive behavioral therapy, and the trauma informed variation of CBT, and because it was actually the cheapest intervention to stand up capacity. And so we had a statewide effort where we actually paid people to come get trained so that they would become potential resources to the child welfare system across. And the hope was through building that capacity, we could intervene before the crisis. And by doing so, delay the likelihood of a young person receiving a diagnosis of a mental illness. So not a perfect answer to your question, but the approach that we took. We also revisited this question of the relationship between diagnosis and payment rates. Because in a lot of ways, there was an unintended consequence of if you don't have a diagnosis, you get paid this. If you have this diagnosis, you get paid that. If you have this diagnosis, you get that. And so it was hard to untangle. Were they picking the diagnosis because they were really trying to figure out how to get the rate, or was it the reverse? And so, so we created these blended rates, so that you wouldn't go a doctor agency or program. We tried to eliminate the incentive of just trying to say that all of their kids had the highest rates of problems, so that they were getting the same payment for every kid. So we try to create these blended rates under the assumption that you'd have a mix of kids. And so we're not going to ask you to choose where they're at and then pay you. We're going to estimate where they're at and put them in these blended rates. It was a way, it changed the composition of the diagnosis across time. Again, I don't mean to suggest that they were intentionally doing that. But I talked about earlier about, the challenges of aligning policies with incentives and psychotropic meds, behavioral health, is a great example of that. I mean, I think the other cross-system work that's important is that most child welfare agencies still pay for their med and therapy through Medicaid. So Medicaid is setting rates, Medicaid is setting contracts, and the child welfare agencies are accessing them. So for a long time, Medicaid said that you could only bill for one session on one day, which meant that if Johnny needed to go to therapy, and then the foster parent had a second session so they too could get the help they needed, that was 2 visits, not 1. Medicaid would let you do it. And so there was a bunch of renegotiations with Medicaid to try to rationalize the unique circumstances of kids in foster care in particular, so that the provision of treatment was rationalized in ways that responded to the way the system was organized, rather than assuming that foster care kids will be equally successfully served by policies that relate to a whole bunch of other kids that aren't the circumstances of foster care or JJ. that was one of the interesting things about going to DC, and trying to talk about improving individual outcomes, not just systems outcomes. Um, because, in order to get to individual outcomes, you need to have much more of a targeted intervention for which you could attribute the results, and the challenge in that circumstance was that the Medicaid policies themselves created this kind of, the Medicaid policies themselves treated all the kids as if they were the same, even though the treatment provider was a very specific treatment provider, right? So it attached the policy to the individual child and not the agency. And so we were able to restructure the policy for them to recognize that if Johnny goes to this agency, there's a reason why they're going to that agency. And the rate ought to be based on going to that particular circumstance. So anyway, but the most fascinating thing about Medicaid and cross systems work is the federal Medicaid department has no idea who uses their services. They see themselves as the payer. So we sat down with them one time and we said that for the 0 to 18 population, kids in foster care are 2% of the Medicaid eligible population. They consume 30 to 40% of the mental health resources. They said, really? they have no way to segment. They have no way to analyze, and so how can you lead an agency designed around producing better outcomes for kids in different circumstances and have no idea who is actually benefiting from the services that. So people told me that if you want to figure out this outcome thing, this thing where you get to individual outcomes, you got to find a way to get Medicaid to recognize that that's what we're trying to accomplish. And so it forced a long set of conversations, which were really powerful. We were able to fold a lot of those ideas into the Affordable Care Act, not the part that subsidized folks that didn't have access to treatment, but kids that would have otherwise been eligible. We were able to fold a lot of these ideas into there, which was really powerful. And then there was all of this innovation money that was also part of the Affordable Care Act. And a lot of that a big chunk of that got dedicated to understanding the intersection of treatment for kids in foster care, in the juvenile justice, and behavioral health, to try to incentivize more targeted interventions earlier in the stage of their behavioral disconnect, so to try to get to them earlier, intervene more effectively early in their developmental process. It was really exciting to be able to build all of that stuff into their innovation funds. So we learned a bunch of stuff about serving that population differently. Nobody knew about it because everybody was against Obamacare, but there were some real policy innovations there, and there are a bunch of kids across systems that were better served as a result of that policy, but nobody will ever know it. Thanks for doing this. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much for sharing your wealth of knowledge with us. Truly appreciate your time and feel very inspired by your work. I will